we often say that our science should speak for itself. So if you don't understand it, it's your problem. So is that the case?
When people think science should speak for itself, is it doesn't speak very loudly or clearly. Like the idea that science speaks for itself, nothing speaks for itself. As humans, we're story animals first. If you don't tell the story that your science tells, your audience will make one up. We'll figure out the story. And then you're missing an opportunity. You're missing an opportunity to share the story that you want your science to tell and you're hoping your science will tell. And you're defaulting to whatever story it is that the audience makes from it.
But traditionally, I think we often, as scientists, we feel there's a certain moral duty to show the data instead of telling a big story, telling an emotional story. Because in science, there is a certain consensus of being unbiased. What would you tell those who feel like they are afraid of making that emotional connection with the audience and giving a story instead of just showing the data?
I think that idea of story or data is a false binary. It's not story or data, it's story and data. And the idea of story or objectivity is a false binary. We have an obligation to not only share the data, but also share our interpretation of the data and our feeling about the data. Otherwise, there would be no discussion section. When we do a journal article, there's a discussion section. We don't just show data.
Right, so should the talk be mostly about the discussion section then? Especially when you give it to a broader audience.
One of the mistakes I think people make is they think about trying to find the average within their audience. And there is no average within the audience. The audience familiarity with your science is very bimodal. And in some situations, like a keynote, it's bimodal this way, where most of the people are not very familiar with your work. And in a smaller niche group, it's bimodal this way, where there are more people who are familiar with your work or familiar with the field. And I think what we need to do is we need to be toggling our talk to not even necessarily the majority of the audience, but to the audience that we want to reach, but without excluding the other people from the entirety of the talk. So for a keynote speech, you might have a 80-20 relationship with a more general audience. And 20% of the time, you may dive into something very specific that 80% of the audience no longer understands you. I think that's okay.
But only for a short time.
But only for a short time. And I think it's actually a mistake when people don't do that. Because then the people within your field who would benefit from that don't get the opportunity to go there.
When we say know your audience, what does it mean then in practice? When you want to prepare your talk, what do you go through? What kind of thinking process do you go through when you want to target the audience that you know you will face?
Right. It's a really important question. It's a really important question. We need to start with the audience. We need to start with two things, audience and purpose. But you've brought out audience, so let's talk about audience. First of all, the mistake most people make is the majority of the audience with whom they talk to about their research is their own lab. So the audience that they're used to talking about their research with is infinitely more familiar, even than the most familiar audience. So our audience is less familiar than most people think it is. And then I just do this very simple bimodal distribution, ask people to do this very simple bimodal distribution. What percentage of your audience do you think will understand the technical language and the technical complexity of your research? 10%, 20%, 50%, pick a number. technical language, technical complexity. What percentage of your audience won't? The balance, right? The balance is on the other side. And then understand that this is the distribution of the audience. And then you switch to purpose, and when you start thinking about purpose, you can decide strategically, how much time do I want to spend with which audience? Not how do I try and thread the needle and talk to them both at the same time? Because it never works. When you try and talk to both at the same time, you end up talking to neither one very well.
Maybe I can push back here a little bit from the student's perspective. So when I was a student, I always felt like when I have to give a talk in front of professors, they should be much smarter than me. So whatever I'm going to show, they will probably know it. There's very little chance they will have no idea about the concept that I'm discussing, right? So in those cases, my observation is that many students suffer from this. So when they come to a conference, they try to complicate the talk so much that barely anybody understands it, because they imagine that everyone is an expert and everyone is a much better expert perhaps than they are, especially if those are professors in front of them. And the same happens at interviews, even at faculty interviews. So it's on the borderline with students trying to impress the audience too. How do you really tackle this situation? So if you talk to a student who says, okay, I have this issue, or maybe that student even doesn't recognize it.
Right. There are a couple pieces of the puzzle going on. One is imposterism and insecurity about your own level of expertise. And, frankly, this is perfectly normal. One of the things we need to understand with PhDs, and you know this, is that it's a transitional moment in your intellectual journey. Your entire intellectual career, you've been speaking to someone who knows more than you do. And the conversation has not been a conversation of peers. It's not been a conversation of information sharing. It's been a test. And the way to pass the test is to give as much information as you possibly can and hope something that you give was the right answer. And this is education until you get to a PhD or you get to a real research-based master's, at which point you have to transition to realizing that there was a knowledge gap. People actually didn't know, which is why you're doing the research. And the audience really doesn't know more than you do. Do they know more about some of the background? Sure. Do they know more about maybe some of the complexity or maybe some of the discussion pieces where the implications for other research or other areas where it might be applicable? Sure, because they have 10, 20, 30 years of experience. But they don't know more about what you did and how you did it. And they don't know more about what you found out. And this is that piece, again, I'm back to this bimodal space a little bit. We need to allow ourselves to have enormous confidence in the things that we should know. And then in the areas where we don't know and we're unsure, we need to have an enormous amount of intellectual humility. And when we do those two things, right? When we have confidence about the things that we know, because we should, and we have humility about the things that we don't, and we're open, and we want to listen, and we want to learn, then you've arrived, right? And some of this imposterism goes away, and some of this need to use a conference presentation as if it was a test and prove how smart you are goes away. And you realize that the conference presentation isn't about proving how smart you are. The conference presentation is simply about sharing something you've learned that other people don't know yet.
Yeah, I think one great way to also think about it is to imagine yourself being on the other side. So you're sitting in the audience. What kind of talk do you want to listen to? What kind of talk would make you most absorbed? So that should be a very good then compass for you. Let's say a student's trying to simplify the talk. What I see often is that students just struggle because they feel like at some point they will look too dumb. What is the boundary? Like at which point can you say, yeah, this is too much simplification, but this is too little simplification. So what is the band in which you should stay? How do you determine that?
Einstein has a great quote here: as simple as possible, and no simpler. and he was a pretty smart guy and thought about this, right? He actually thought a lot about communication, which I know you know, but lots of people don't realize that. The piece that I think people need to understand is that the simple understanding is not where it stops. We don't build a simple understanding so that ends the conversation. We build a simple understanding in order to begin the conversation. And one of the things I work on with students in my program and students that I work with in programs is a one sentence, 50 words. Tell me your research in 50 words. In order to some sort of problem or knowledge gap, I am some sort of hypothesis, like what are you trying to figure out? By, how are you figuring it out? So that, how will this understanding change the future? How will this understanding move science forward? How will this understanding? And it's that understanding that audiences need early. Because once they understand, I actually call it a Wade statement. What am I actually doing? And that's the thing that as audiences, if we think about what we're doing in a talk, we sit there in the beginning of the talk and we get inundated with information, and we're trying to figure out what the heck's actually going on. What are they actually doing? And then once we figure out what they're actually doing, we can suddenly pay attention and make sense of the information that they're sharing. So this idea that we need a simple understanding is not because that's the end of the story. It's because that's where the story needs to begin. The story needs to begin with a relatively simple and not the opening minute, that's a different conversation, but the second and the third minute needs to be a simple understanding of what we're actually doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and what the significance of it will be. And then we build in the complexity. Then we add in the complexity. And that's when we go to that bimodal audience, we get so complex that potentially 80% of the audience can't follow us at some point. And that's okay. But because they have that simple understanding, the audience recognizes, okay, I don't understand this, but I'm looking around and I see the people who do understand it leaning in and listening, and this person must be pretty smart. It's actually a place where you get enormous credibility if the people who can understand are nodding and leaning in. And if they're shaking their head, you're in trouble.
That's true. That's true. There's a huge social component to the perception of the talk, especially in large audiences. Maybe I can try to push back a little bit here too.
Absolutely.
So as a scientist myself, I think I have a pretty good visual thinking, in which sense that it's been developed over decades. So we are used to seeing slides all the time. We're used to seeing graphs and figures, images all the time. So we're very good visual thinkers often. And when somebody's giving a talk, I often find myself being absorbed by the slides, especially when the slides switch. Next slide, and then the first 5 seconds I barely hear the speaker because the slide is full of information, and I'm getting absorbed by it, and I'm trying to understand it. And often, especially when the talks are not very engaging, I find myself just waiting for that slide that will surprise me. And I think in that sense, many scientists, I don't want to speak on everyone's behalf, but my feeling is that many scientists are somewhat similar, especially in their senior years of their career. And as a result, I think their perception of a talk would be different than the perception by someone who actually has not developed that degree of visual thinking. So do you think that should be taken into account? Or is it that a great talk is great everywhere? So slides simply just follow the talk.
Yeah. I don't think a great talk is great everywhere. I think by definition, a great talk is the intersection between the content and the moment and the audience. And they don't replicate. One of the problems I think we have with the concept of a research presentation is that people think of it as monolithic. People think of a research presentation as a research presentation. Oh, I have to do a research presentation. It's like, no. Who are you doing a research presentation for? What conference or what place, what situation are you doing the research presentation in?
And what is the goal?
And what is the goal? So for instance, say you were a PhD student and you were trying to get a postdoc position in a very specific kind of lab, and you had 75 people in the audience, 5 of whom ran the kinds of labs that you wanted a position in. If 70 of the people in that presentation thought the presentation wasn't very good, but you got 5 emails from the 5 people running labs, the presentation would actually be very successful for the purpose that you had. That's obviously a very extreme example, but too often we don't think about, we're like, okay, here's my research presentation, plug and play. And presenting well is not a plug and play activity. As you started with your opening question, some people, the visuals will be a very important component of it. And you started by thinking about, okay, you have this subset of the audience of senior scientists who are visual learners or visual thinkers. Is that the subset of the audience in this particular talk that you want to focus on or not? And if it's not the subset that you want to focus on, can you still find a way to speak to them? Can you still find a way to have a moment for them, even though they're not your primary audience? Because it's nice, the extreme example I gave a second ago of like 70 people thinking it wasn't a very good talk, like I'm not a fan of that kind of talk because you've now wasted the time of 70 people in the audience. And I think that's unfair. You shouldn't be wasting the time of the majority of the audience just because you're hyper-focused on your own purpose.
I would even say that a conference is not quite the place where you give postdoc interview talks.
Agreed.
When I advise people for very simple cases, for regular research presentations, what I often say is a great talk looks like this. You give a very simple material, relatively simple material, accessible to pretty much everyone. And then you make dips every 3, every 5 slides maybe, but you make dips in the form of 1 or 2 slides where you go deep enough so that the experts, and maybe from different parts of the audiences, so each dip actually engages different types of experts. So then you make a dip, go back up again, make a dip, go back up again. The same works very well during faculty interviews, not during postdoc interviews, because like I said, a postdoc is often the person who is interviewed in a lab that targets that specific direction. So they want to
That's
see
a giant dip.
Right. That's a giant dip, yeah, for sure. So what would you say? Is that a good first order approximation of how a good talk should look like?
It's a fantastic strategy. It's a fantastic strategy because what you're doing is you're acknowledging that there's that bimodal group. You're going a step further and acknowledging that the expert part of that bimodal group actually has different areas of expertise. And then you're modulating back and forth. Because what you don't want to do if you're giving a 20-minute talk or even a 12-minute talk, you don't want to go for 4 minutes somewhere where you've lost most of the audience. You want to go for 45 seconds somewhere. And then you want to come back. And you don't want to wait until 7 minutes to go somewhere interesting for the people who have real expertise in that area. Because if you wait until 7 minutes, all of those people have left the room. And they haven't actually gotten up and left the room. But they're
doing different things, right?
They're on their phone.
Exactly.
Or they're in their own head, but they're no longer listening to you.
What's your impression of that time? I mean, I know that the attention span is shortening now. We're getting used to short form content too much a bit, I think. But in general, when you advise students, what is the approximate time frame you give them in which they should switch gears? Because otherwise people will disengage.
It's very dependent on the length of the talk. So I do talks as short as 3 minutes. And in talks as short as 3 minutes, there's usually only one dip. And it's between about 1:15 and 2:15. And somewhere in there, you're going deep. If you're doing a 10-minute talk or a 12-minute talk, you go deep 2 or 3 times. And one of those times should be in the opening. One of those times should be in those first 2 or 3 minutes so that the experts in the audience know that there's something here for them. If you're giving an hour-long talk, then you may spend 5 minutes somewhere or 8 minutes somewhere. I have a question back for you. Am I allowed to ask a question?
Of course.
How do you feel when people give you some declaration? So I'll give you an example. We're talking in relatively plain language, and then we might say, okay, for those of you who are cell biologists, I'm going to get pretty technical here and we'll have some fun for a moment.
Well, I'm not a biologist, so I'm excluded. That's my first unconscious thinking. So the reaction would be, okay, I'm going to wait until the speaker comes back to me.
And then when they come back, they say, okay, so now that we're through the really technical part, let's go back to the bigger picture, or let's go back to what this means, which is the invitation for you to come back in. I guess my question for you was, do you appreciate when a speaker has some cues that either they're moving into a more technical place and that they're coming out of a more technical place?
Okay, I would say for me, when the speaker is diving in, I don't want to know that in advance. I want to see that being in development. But when the speaker goes back, it's not that important, but I think it's more on the positive side for me at least, because if I was too much in my own thoughts because I don't understand the material for whatever reason, it wakes me up a little bit.
Right. It's an invitation to return.
That is better than an invitation to disconnect and wait until, we go through the dip.
Interesting.
Is that very uncommon?
No. No. Depending on the length of the talk and depending on how long it's been non-technical, and depending on what I had used as a technical example, had I used the technical example in your field, then it would have been an invitation for you to pay more attention.
But in those cases, if it's my field, I will likely be paying attention anyway.
Paying attention anyway.
Or waiting for that complexity to emerge. And I'm like, okay, now it's interesting.
Now it's interesting.
I'm looking at interesting slides or whatever. It's an
Yeah.
interesting part of the talk. So it's, at least for me, that works this way. So, but I can imagine it depends also on like how long that disengagement is supposed to be. If somebody is saying, for example, in the next 3 minutes, I'm going to explain how these specific cells behave in this environment. And for those of you who are not quite in this field, please stay with me. We will switch to whatever else. That can help because 3 minutes is quite a lot.
Right. Stay with me as best you can.
Yep, that can help. But I feel like that is a bad style, the bad pattern of the talk from the very beginning. So it just means
because
like
it's too long.
Yes. Maybe we can switch gears and
Sure.
Discuss more specific strategies and more specific things that students and faculties could think about and maybe adapt. So when it comes to memorization, I'm curious, what's your opinion about memorization, whether you advise it or not, and in which cases? So normally, the way I see it is that there is a trade-off between memorization and improvisation. And there are two ways to think about memorization. The first one is memorization kind of takes your bandwidth. You're constantly thinking during the talk about what you need to say next, kind of. Even though you memorize it, but somehow it keeps you too tense and it keeps you afraid of breaking the pattern that you memorized. But there is another way to think about it, which is that memorization actually frees some bandwidth because it reduces the cognitive load. You don't have to think, you just shoot the words out, sort of. And that helps with improvisation because you can always, when you memorize your talk very well, you can always deviate from the line of your talk, improvise, go back very easily. So what's your take on this? What is your experience with students and faculty?
I like to think of something I call mastery instead of memorization. Memorization, by definition, is words, right? It's a particular word order sequence. And my experience is 90% of the time, it results in scenario A, not scenario B. People get stuck and then they freeze because they got a word wrong or they forgot to, and then they're in. One of the things that I think we have very good radar for as audiences is how connected we are. How connected is the speaker to this moment? How present are they in the presentation? And when you memorize, people end up in scenario A where they're present in their own head trying to remember what they're saying next. And they're not actually present in the room, they're present in their head. And as an audience, we want them present in the room with us. Whereas if you have mastery of your talk, if you know the sequence through which you'll speak, and you may memorize particular turns of phrase, you may memorize particular sentences because you've said them, because you have mastery over them, you reuse the same sentences, you reuse the same description, you reuse the same metaphor. But reusing it is different than memorizing it. I also think we're in an interesting age because of AI and because of generative AI. I think people who memorize, people will wonder, how much do they actually know? Who wrote that? Because they're not speaking from mastery, they're speaking from memorization.
I think another great example could be for those who are often on YouTube these days, what I notice is there are a lot of new channels appearing where AI is just showing you figures or videos and they just reads the script. And at first it may sound like, oh, there's a lot of information there, but then you quickly disengage because there's no human being behind it. And I often think that, let's suppose we have a conference where a speaker is just AI. There's no speaker there. There's just
no
a
speaker.
lot of slides, a big audience. How many people will be listening to that talk? And it's not happening so far, and I don't think it will ever happen. But there are some other examples that are a bit on the borderline. So there are hybrid conferences where a speaker is brought online to a live audience. And what we often see is that the audience is largely disconnected. It's because there's no that emotional, personal connection to someone who's on stage. I think this is where, indeed, memorization, it just destroys that connection to a great degree.
Yeah, I'm not a fan, except in very narrow, short, something like the 3-minute thesis competition.
Those ones are different, right?
But again, that's where that's a very particular type of research presentation. It's its own genre, and different genres have different rules. One of the frustrations I think people have with the TED Talk space and talking to academics about, oh, aren't TED Talks great? They're like, well, yeah, they're great performances. I mean, the ones that are great performances. And I think that's where memorization takes you. Memorization takes you into a performative space. And we don't want to be performed to by researchers. We want to be engaged, but not performed.
Maybe here I can push back a little, just in my experience. So if a student, I can speak for myself too, partly, is not comfortable giving talks to such an extent that you feel like it's a bit robotic on stage, then actually adding that performance component through memorization, it doesn't mean that it should be a perfectly memorized talk. It can be somewhat practiced, somewhat memorized talk where a student feel like there is now, he doesn't have to keep, or she doesn't have to keep thinking about what's going to come next because it's all in a memory. Now that person can just execute on that memory. And it means that there is a bit more space for walking, for maybe asking questions, maybe for more interesting improvisation, rather than a talk where a student is just thinking, what am I going to talk about on the next slide? So in those cases, I feel like a little memorization, a little performance is always better than no performance. But when it gets to the extent when a talk looks like a TED Talk, but at a conference, that definitely doesn't really meet the expectations.
Right. So what you're describing there, having moments that are so well known, they're memorized. Having moments where you do certain things because, there's a great moment in a 3MT talk from 6 or 7 years ago where he was talking about a cancer. Shane was doing this. He was talking about creating a nanoparticle that would encapsulate a cancer drug. So you take the cancer drug, you put it inside the nanoparticle, and then it moves through your bloodstream. And then you shine a light on it where the cancer is, and the nanoparticle opens up and the drug's released. That's a performative moment that was practice, but the origin of it was not performative. The origin of it was authentic. The origin of it was him explaining this, because in the 3MT, oh, by the way, you don't get more than one slide. So you can't do this on a slide. You have to do it with your hands. That I would actually not call memorization or performative. I would call it mastery. And I think that's where my preference for that mastery term, where it's not memorization where like we have the entire script and we're playing it out. And it's not performative where somebody said, well, if you were to use this gesture with your audience in this moment, that would trigger this response because we know from body language that this gesture triggers that, which where there's nothing authentic going on. There's nothing emerging from the speaker. And my argument is always that what we want is we want you. And we want you to be engaged with us, and we want you to be engaged with your work. And that needs to come from within you. It needs to come from mastery of what you're speaking about, and then permission. And this is one of the things I work with a lot of people. Permission to actually be human. Permission to not stand behind the podium still and be objective and confident and professional and stay in this bandwidth the entire time because I want to be objective and professional and confident. So I'm going to stand here and just deliver my talk to you. It may be professional and confident, but it's monotone and monophysical and monodelivery. And we know that as humans, we have a very hard time continuing to pay attention to that.
For sure. But I feel like there are two components. First is some people really want to stay professional for whatever reason, maybe because that's how it was in their environment where they came from. And there's a second reason that is the fear of stage. And actually, there's a third one. Some people don't fear that. They just feel uncomfortable being in the spotlight. I mean, they think like, okay, we're scientists. We're not supposed to be public figures. Is this
Right.
notion that, okay, a scientist is someone who's sitting somewhere in the lab, hiding maybe from the public and just doing some research that nobody understands. But also today we see that the public doesn't quite understand that science for this reason, because there's no connection, there's no communication to the public. So some scientists do try to move to the public, to the communication with the public, but still there's this spotlight evasion, sort of. I'm not sure how to put it. So people try to evade that spotlight as much as they can. And that translates even into scientific conferences, into the departmental seminars where people, you see that they're stressed, not because they're afraid of the public itself, but like it's not the comfort zone that they've developed. So what's the best way then to tackle it, to develop that comfort zone on stage? Except for giving a lot of talks. So often it's hard. We don't have hundreds of talks per year.
You know, one thing you have to decide is do you want to do it? Do you want to be a more engaging, more memorable speaker? Yes or no? If you just want to be acceptable, you don't need to move beyond that space. Moving beyond that space is not for everybody. But if you do want to be a more engaging, memorable speaker, and I would argue if you want your science to have more traction, or if you want your career to have more traction, then you should want to be a more engaging, memorable speaker, because if you're not an engaging, memorable speaker, you've shut down one of the avenues for your career and your research to get more traction. Now, to the question of, so how do you get better at this without doing 100 events? And my answer is, we kind of have to do 100 events, but you don't need an audience at them. And what I do is I tell people they need to practice the experience. You need to gain experience doing this, but not every practice needs to actually have an audience. You can create the experience, or you can create a lot of the experience without an audience. Too often when I see people doing, when they practice their talk, they're trying to memorize it and they're practicing it. They're practicing it in their head. They're not practicing it out loud, but we speak out loud. They're practicing in a bedroom with the door closed, and they're practicing quietly so that their partner or their roommate can't hear them. But this is not how we do things. We do things in big spaces with a lot of chairs, and the PowerPoint not in front of us, but behind us. We all have university classrooms at our disposal. You need to go practice in that classroom space. You need to practice either being at a podium or being in the front of a room with no podium. You need to practice a voice that people can hear who are 100 feet away, and there are 100 people in the room absorbing noise. You need to practice being introduced and speaking starting on command. So one of the things I literally do is say, record someone introducing your talk on your phone. Set a timer for 5 minutes. Go to an empty room. Put your screens on the stage. Press play on the timer. Sit on the stage facing the audience as if you were the next panel member. Play a YouTube video with someone else's talk. The end of their talk, or when the 5 minutes goes off, press play, stand up, go to the front of the stage, start speaking. Because that's the experience. The experience is the room. The experience is big slides behind you. The experience is speaking loudly. The experience is speaking not when you decide to start, but when someone else tells you to start. The experience is having some nerves beforehand. So I tell people, don't try and not be nervous when you're doing this, practice the experience. Allow yourself to be nervous and then do it anyway. And now we can get some of those reps that we need without the reps only being at a conference. Because we don't get enough reps. No one gets enough reps in front of the room until they become a teacher or a tenured professor with a bunch of speaking conferences. We don't get, like, graduate students don't get enough reps. So you have to create your own reps.
Right. So I think that this is where maybe I can add a few extra points. Well, first of all, if you are a PI, make sure your students have a lot of seminars to present in a group. Second,
give them reps.
Exactly. And second, which is very important, is that I've seen, I don't know, many hundreds of seminars from students, postdocs. I did myself them too. So what I've noticed is that about 80% of students and postdocs don't really try hard during those seminars. They treat them as time when they can throw some data on the slides and just walk through those, instead of seeing that as an opportunity to practice a good talk. And this is where you can basically increase the number of reps by tenfold, just by trying to commit every single time you have a chance to present. And if I count the number of chances I had to present in my entire career during even PhD, pre-PhD, post-PhD, it would be an immense number. So it's a lot more than an average professor gives talks during in 1 year, let's say. So in reality, I think a lot of students actually have that time to practice, have those opportunities, but they just don't take them. And this is where I really, really urge everyone to take it really seriously if you want to really become a good speaker.
I think it was a really good insight on your part that people have more practice space than they think. But the problem is they don't invest in their best effort. The biggest thing going on is people protecting themselves by not trying as hard as they could, by not treating it like a big stage moment, because it's not, it's a closed seminar. But by not treating it like a big stage moment, they can tell themselves, well, I didn't give my best effort. And until we start treating things like big stage moments, until we start actually giving our best effort, we don't get better. It's not practice if we're not giving our best effort in the moment.
I think that you need to get into this mindset of being constantly invested in what you do. And basically, for these talks, it's incredibly useful. So each time you change something, you play with something, you try to tune better to the audience, especially if you know in advance who the audience is. Even if it's your fellow lab members, it's still worth it.
Yeah.
So it's still the mindset that you're developing, and that mindset can go long ways, of course. In general, what is your strategy for typical research talks, like when you advise people on how to make a construct that talk, 10 minutes, 15 minutes talk, 20 minutes talk, a research talk at a typical conference? What is the structure that you would say is fairly universal across these talks? We know how people usually give it. There's an introduction. There is, it all starts with certain credentials that you put on slide, especially on the first slide. Then there's an introduction. Then there are some results and perhaps some conclusions in a nutshell. But do you advise other structures? Do you think that something else can be a lot more impactful?
Especially for people who are nervous. So we have this nervous piece in our head now. I advise starting with something that you're particularly interested in talking about, and then backfilling what people generally think of as traditional introduction, credentials, that sort of thing. So start someplace interesting. Ideally, start someplace where the audience will be particularly interested. And the way I think about this is, rather than modeling after the way a journal talk is constructed, which if we think not about how a journal talk is constructed, but instead we think about how a journal article is consumed, right? We read the abstract, and then it's set up like a filing cabinet. And we go to the part that we're interested in if we're given the choice. And then we have some questions. So we may go to a result or we may go to a discussion. And then we have a question about the methodology, or we have a question about the background, or we have a question about why someone chose this topic, or we have a question about, and we bounce around. And I call this model answers and questions rather than intro methodology results discussion, right?
Does it mean that in a paper, if you typically jump into the actual results and you look for what is the novelty of that work, if that's the first thing you look at, you actually have to present it that way too. So you start from the novelty, okay, this is what we show, and then you can proceed to explain why this is actually what we show. So explaining where those results come from. But isn't it kind of destroying that tension that we often want to create in a story that we present? So we start with something that is kind of unknown. So we're trying to slowly let the audience dive into the scene, into this story.
You can create the tension by leaving some of it unknown, and new tension is created because if it's novel, people now want to know how you figured it out. People now want to know how robust the result is. People now want to know why you did it in the particular way you did it, or what other applications it may have. And there's tension around all of those questions as well. And I would argue when you start with a typical introduction, there's actually very little tension. What there is a bunch of information, a bunch of data that's being shared.
And that is often very well known to the audience, especially if you talk to the experts. And maybe a small remark here. So when I advise students that I work with, they usually say that your first few seconds sometimes, but a first minute is when the audience comes to you and wants to see you. They wants to see your talk. They invested that time. They're probably for a reason sitting in that room. And then when
Absolutely.
you start the talk with the most obvious thing for the audience, they feel like, okay, so looks like the talk is wasted. So the time is wasted. We should, of course, then they pull up the phones or leave. So this is where I think the very first, like the introduction is where most people disengage and they stay disengaged.
It's very hard to get audiences to re-engage once they've left. We talked a little bit about this earlier of dipping into more technical things and coming back out and dipping back in and coming, because you have this bimodal audience. If you spend too long in either place, and to the topic now, if you spend too long in the beginning with things that are already known, then people disengage and they think they might come back, but they don't, usually.
Do you think that we give this obvious introduction as our attempt to be traditional in our talks and protect ourselves against judgment? And if yes, what is the best way to overcome this fear of being non-trivial in your talk, being unexpected in certain ways in your talk? Because if you come and give a talk where everything is reversed, obviously you go against the norms.
I think it's, this is one of the reasons I'm committed to doing the work that I'm doing, is to try and change some of these norms and make it easier. It's not always easy to go against the norms. And when I'm talking with younger researchers, a lot of the researchers I train are PhDs and postdocs. And I say, listen, your supervisor may say, no, you're doing it this way. At which point, while you're under the supervision of your supervisor, you probably are best doing it that way. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't start to understand how audiences engage and how audiences disengage and how people process information. And people don't process information from background to specific. People process information by figuring something out that they then want to learn more about. And that's how we come to know things. We don't come to know things by being given an encyclopedia of background information. So, it takes a little bravery to do something a little different, but my experience is it only takes you doing it once, because once you've done it once, the feedback you'll get will be positive, not negative, and you'll do it again and again and again. It was funny, I was training a group 2 weeks ago, and I bring people from last year's cohort to train this year's cohort. And last year's cohort, we were sitting around afterwards, just kind of shooting the breeze after this year's cohort had left. And they all were talking to each other, and they said, we can't do things the old way anymore. And they were talking about how they developed slides, or they were talking about how they said, I had this presentation and it wasn't a big deal. I was only doing it to my lab, but I had to do it the right way. And it just made me feel so good about the impact that I was having. And once you learn to start doing this in a way that people become engaged, you'll never stop. You'll never go back.
You need just to start it.
You just need to start.
What's your advice for presenting your credibility? So how do you initiate that connection with the audience? How do you present yourself at the very beginning in a way that would set you up for a very good talk and set the audience up for being engaged as much as possible? Because typically what we see, for those who are listening, some students may not be attending so many conferences. So the typical way it goes is that you're presented by someone who's organizing a symposium or a seminar, and that can, take a while. So they go over your affiliations, awards, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think anybody was really paying attention. Maybe past first 10 seconds, hardly. But it's kind of a tradition. So we do it out of tradition, out of respect. And if you're a speaker, how would you start it? How should you go? Especially if you lose that audience at the beginning, people are like, okay. We're waiting.
I think that you should earn people's attention before you spend a lot of time telling people who you are. I like to tell people, make the audience want to know who you are before you tell them your name. I also think that, people triangulate credibility. And they triangulate it from all sorts of different places. Triangulate's the wrong word because it comes from too many places to be a simple triangulation. And some of that is the way you stand. And some of that is the confidence that you have in your voice. And those things you need to train so that you can do that even while anxious. Other pieces of that are the types of background data that you share. Do you share something that everybody already knows? Or do you share something that's 2 or 3 layers deeper that somebody says, oh, I didn't realize that? Some of that is obviously methodological in the approach and the rigor with which you do things. And this doesn't come from a long recipe of how you did the entire methodology. It comes with unpacking a particular aspect of the methodology in a way that is deep and robust and demonstrates the seriousness and the rigor with which you approach research. You do this in your physical and vocal presence. You do this in your approach. You do this in the kinds of information that you choose to share, in the depth of that information. And the audience in that first 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds decides that they trust you. And if they don't, then it doesn't matter how interesting your talk is, because they're not quite sure that you know what you're talking about, or you treat the research enterprise as seriously as the research enterprise should be treated. And then you've lost them.
What about intermediate messages and kind of punchlines? So you started the talk and then you want to make sure your messages come across, but not at the very end, but of course during the talk. So what is your advice on that? So should you present your messages more somewhere at the beginning in the first half of your talk, or spread across the talk? And what's the best way to present them?
When you say your messages, will you tell me a little more about that?
For example, you design a chemical that tackles certain problem, and you say this chemical has this kind of properties. That's message 1. This chemical can be produced in this kind of quantities. This message is message 2. Then you can say, well, we also analyze the physical-chemical sort of nature of the processes that are happening when you put this chemical in this environment, and we see that the result is this and this. It's very, very typical talk that we see often, and it's kind of the messages that come out of a paper. So if you take a paper, you ask to summarize it in 3-4 key messages, or like bullet points. These are sort of the sentences that are key messages. That's what I call key messages. So what's the best way to present them, or should you present them?
One of the ways you put together your talk is being very clear what these key messages are in your own head. So one of the things I do when I'm working with people and people are trying to build a 15-minute talk is I say, okay, you need a 5-minute talk first. Not a 30-minute talk that you cut to 20, that you cut to 18, that you then do in 15, but a 5-minute talk. And then you build up the 5-minute talk into 15 with additional detail. But this 5-minute talk, or this 3 to 5 minute talk, has these key messages, right? And each one of these key messages then is going to become 2, 3, 4 minutes, depending on whether your talk is 8 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And one of the things we know is if we want someone to remember something, we need to say things more than once. We can't say something once and expect that someone will remember it 15 minutes later, even 5 minutes later. So one of the things that we need to do with these key messages is we need to come back to them. So at the end, if you're talking about how these processes work, you can remind people what the key chemical was and what the key interaction is. And then you can talk about how that interaction happens. So when you get to the third part, you can remind people about part 1 and 2 as you move into part 3. And when you start, you can either name all 3 parts, or you can say this is the first of 3 parts. You start to create a mental model in your audience's brain. And it's not a table of contents. It's very different than a table of contents. A table of contents actually tends to give people permission to stop listening because now they know what you're going to say and now they're not nervous that they'll miss out. This is more akin to foreshadowing that you'd think of in a book or a movie, where we tease what's coming, not so explicitly that people know, but so people want to know. And then we remind people where we've been so that people can remember, right? And it's different when you're working with a written text. With a written text, people can go back, people are jotting notes, and people are scaffolding that information and literally going back and double checking and reminding themselves. A conference space is different because we're really reliant on creating an oral memory. You know, most people in a conference space aren't sitting there with an outline of your presentation, jotting down notes that they're going to come back to next week and look at again, which is one of the reasons classroom lectures as models for oral presentations don't work very well. Like classroom lectures, students will come back because they have to. They're going to be tested and graded. But a presentation isn't that space.
Yeah, I think that a presentation at a conference often connects in our minds the speaker to the topic, sometimes to the results if we are good enough to remember those results. Because we have 10 talks in the afternoon, so how do you remember them all during the day? It's really hard. So it creates that connection in our minds that helps us later identify that specific professor or student as someone who works in that field, as someone who knows this stuff, or someone who doesn't.
Right.
So I think that long term, say a few months after the conference, you remember some speakers who showed very interesting science. You don't really remember all the science. That's impossible. Sometimes you don't even remember the science itself, but you remember that speaker made me feel amazing about something, right? And do you think that this is the actual goal, the ultimate goal of a presentation at a conference or even at the department? Or is it about knowledge, just passing knowledge? Okay, this is something you have to remember, and that's what you show to the audience.
If you pass knowledge without memory, have you passed knowledge?
Well, I would say you definitely said it out loud. But where it landed, that's a different question.
For me, it's always about what memory are you creating? It always should start with what memory am I trying to create? And then the test becomes what memory did you actually create? One of the exercises that I do is very simple when I'm working with speakers in a group of speakers in a cohort. Somebody will do a talk. We won't give them feedback. What I'll do is I'll interview the audience So I'll be working with a group of 4 or 5 students. A student will give a talk, and then I'll interview the way you might in your lab. But instead of giving feedback to the speaker, what I'll do is I'll interview the audience about what the speaker said. The speaker's not allowed to talk for 5 minutes. For 5 minutes, the speaker just has to listen to the audience answer questions about what they said. And invariably, students tell me over and over again it's the most powerful feedback they've ever gotten on their talk. Because they now know what the audience heard, and they now know what the audience misheard. And once they know that, they can go back and build a better talk. They don't actually need advice. What they need is data. And the data that they need is what people heard.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point because it also extends into the realms of publishing and in publications, it's exactly the same thing. So you can write certain ideas or certain results the way you think they should be presented, but when somebody reads them, that they will not perceive it the same way. And that's why you have to give your draft to others to give feedback. Exactly the same happens for talks. We often see those who are not very experienced, they give talks and they are very surprised indeed that what the audience hears is not what they said or not what they intended to convey.
Right.
I'm very curious what you usually advise for transitioning between slides. So when you give a regular talk without slides, without PowerPoint presentation, I think it's a bit easier. But when you give a PowerPoint slide talk, then the actual transition point is when the audience will see a new visual, and that visual will distract from what you're saying. What is the best way to tackle it? How do you make sure that the audience doesn't feel like they have to engage first hearing you, then switching back to the visuals, then you, then back to the visuals? How to make it more coherent?
3 different ways I talk about doing this with people. One is to create connective tissue between slides. So you can do this if you've ever seen Prezi, where instead of a slide disappearing and a new slide appearing, you shift from one idea to the next. You can do this in PowerPoint. Prezi tends to make people motion sick and overdoes the whole thing. But in PowerPoint, there's something called morphing where things can shift, things can move. You can have an idea that becomes smaller and shifts to the left, and then a new idea or the next iteration of that takes up the main part of the slide. And this starts to create connective tissue between slides, so it's not, okay, now we have a fully new slide. Now it's, okay, there's some things changing, but the shift is more organic and less abrupt. The other thing that I do is preload in your audience's mind the slide. So rather than following the slide, if you're showing someone data, some of the students I work with are trying to get a talk I was working on last week. They're trying to get a forever chemical out of water. So the slide is a downward, it starts top left at 100% of the material, and it's going to shift downward to the right, and I'm going to have a control group, and I'm going to have a test group. And the length of the time was 40 minutes, and it's pretty linear. And you'll see the difference between the two. Let me show them to you. Click. You already see them. You already saw that, Andrew, in your mind. You could see that slide. You knew exactly what it looked like. You just didn't know the relative distance between the two lines. And you didn't know the color. But I could have told you the color. And then your processing time is instant. Whereas if I show you a slide and then I start talking about it, you have to decide, do I listen to you or look at your slide? Because I can't do both at the same time. We know our brains don't work that way.
Exactly. I mean, this is a very good point. So would you say that slides should follow your speech, or you should be following the slides then?
I say you should be conscious about which one you're doing, and you should be strategic. And there are times when you want to follow your slides, but they're usually in the minority. And what we normally see is 99.99% of the time, people are following their slides. And I like to see that ratio be somewhere between 20/80 and 40/60, where you're leading your slides the majority of the time. And often you're standing in front of your slides, actually, and people can see them behind you. Or you step to one side and then step to the other side, and people can only see half your slide or 2/3 of your slide. And then there are times when you want the slide to lead, and you shift out of the way, and you allow people to really see your slide, and you walk them through your slide. And you may actually give people 15 seconds to look at their slide. You may say something like, okay, I'm going to show you the slide, and it's pretty complicated. So I'm going to let everybody look at it for 15 seconds, and then I'll talk about it. And you just let people look because they're going to. And then you say, okay, now let me tell you what's going on here.
Yeah, but that's where also you have the power of a pause. So tell me a little bit more maybe about what are the tactical advantages of making pauses and which ways they are made the best way to control that attention.
I mean, that's one place that you can pause and you can go get a sip of water. Say, okay, this next slide, I'm going to let you preview before I talk about. I'm going to get a sip of water while you preview. Click, go get a sip of water, come back. Earlier, you were talking about 3 key messages, right? Between each one of those key messages, you should give people a little time. One of the things you can do that people don't take advantage of anywhere near as much as they should is actually presenting from both sides of their slides. Don't present always from the right or from the left. And when you finish one of those key messages, it's a perfect place. You can actually look down from the audience. You don't have to look at the audience the entire time. And you can walk to the other side. And you can say something as you're walking like, okay, I'm going to give you a moment to process what we just did before we move on to the next part. Then you get to the other side and you maybe have a sip of water. And then you start again. And now people are ready, and now people have finished thinking about what you just said. And if there'll be a Q&A time at the end, you may say, I'll give you a moment to write down a question here. We're not going to take questions until the end, but we're going to move on. And before I move on, I want to give you a moment to write a question and go get a drink of water. I get a lot of sips of water. It's a good excuse to give people time. And it gives people a cue about how much time they'll have because they can see you do it. And one of the things that becomes awkward is when people give us time, but we don't know how long we'll have. And they say, okay, I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay, great. Let's go. Well, that wasn't a moment. There was no moment there. Right? And we see speakers constantly doing this because they're uncomfortable with silence. So or let me ask you a question, or have you ever thought about, and then they keep talking. And if you're going to ask someone a question, or you're going to say, have you ever thought about, you have to give people a moment to think about those things. Give people a moment to answer the question before you move on and answer it for them, because people need processing time. And too often again, part of the problem is we have an 18-minute talk and we have 15 minutes to give it. Or we have a 12-minute talk and we have 10 minutes to give it.
Exactly. This is where I feel like a lot of people will say, well, we're just standing there waiting and our time is ticking. So how do we keep really on time in that case?
I tell people they should build a talk that can be given in 20% less time than they have. And then they should take the full time to give it. So simple math, if you're giving a 10-minute talk, you should be able to give your talk in 8 minutes, speaking without pause and without just moving through your talk at a quick pace. You should be able to finish in 8 minutes. And then you should take 10 minutes to give that talk.
That's a very good ratio. I really like it. I typically, for myself, I have about a rule of, it depends on the talk, but if it's a research talk, the rule of 1 to 1.5 minutes per slide, meaning that if it's say 12-minute talk, I will have maybe 10 to 12 slides, just moving or rolling through the slides slower than typically people do. But of course, then it depends on, it's getting hard sometimes to present all the work you want to present. And this is where we often have these issues when we're fighting to show off, I would say it,
right?
To show ourselves by showing our work deeper and more extensively, that we will make people appreciate it better. Of course, it doesn't work this way. So I'm curious, in your experience, you've been mentoring so many people. What are the typical challenges that you face, that people, what kind of objections people express when you're trying to say, okay, you have to go this way, not that way? What are the key problems that you see that people not just have, but like you have to really fight through those before the person agrees to really change their style?
It's a really interesting question. The foundation for everything are mindset shifts that you need to make. So we were talking about slides a moment ago. It's the relationship that you have with your slides. You shift that mindset and good things happen. At a fundamental level with content, the mindset shift that you need to make is to not think about it as an oral exam. You're not trying to prove how smart you are.
And it should not be a sales pitch, perhaps.
And it's not a sales pitch.
Because I think there are two ways. So if you're a student, you often try to impress others with who you are, with your work, with your efforts. And as a professor, you try to sell your work, sell yourself, sell your achievements. I feel like a lot of talks are they occupy those two niches, but all the great talks are somewhere else, very far away from those two.
There's something of value for the audience. People ask me, why don't you talk about talks? Why do you talk about presentations? The word presentation, the core of the word is present. And most people think of it as, well, yeah, because I'm presenting something. And that's only one of 3 meanings. The second meaning of present is a gift. And when we start thinking about an exchange of gifts, the audience is giving you their time. So if you do the math and you have a 10-minute presentation and there are 50 people in the audience and everybody spends the same amount of time, you now have 10 hours to prepare that presentation, which many people don't do. I've been gifted their time. What am I gifting them back? What am I giving you of value? And it doesn't mean it needs to be direct value for you personally, but people need to be able to perceive the value of it. That's the second definition of present. The third definition of present is simply to be present. This harkens back to an earlier part of our conversation when we were talking about mastery versus memorization. The problem with memorization is we're actually not present with the audience. We're present in our own head trying to remember what we were going to say. And what your audience deserves is for you to be present with them. if you make that mindset shift to realizing that you're there to share something of value, then the challenge becomes, do I really believe I have something of value to share?
Yeah, that's where a lot of challenges I can imagine, because so many people, especially uh, students and some postdocs, they just don't believe they have sufficiently good presentations to present that value to everyone,
Yep.
especially professors.
So it's interesting you say that. When I actually have this conversation with them, they agree they do. When I actually have the conversation of saying, okay, let's just talk about your research. Forget about the presentation. Why is your research valuable? What are you doing? Why should people be interested in this? What is it like? Is there real value here? They invariably find it. Almost always. They're like, oh yeah, this is good. This is important. And here's why. And I'm like, that's the way you need to be talking about it. Like, just talk about it that way. Forget your presentation. Forget your slides. Just have the conversation you and I just had for 5 minutes about the value of your work, and you'll be in great shape. And that allows them to do the mindset shift of like, okay, there is value here. And once they get comfortable that there's value, when we put 10 other things in, we just watered down the value. We diluted it. So why dilute the value with a bunch of peripheral information that you don't need? Let's keep the value in the spotlight and dilute it as little as possible. And when you make that mindset shift, maybe I'll finish in less than 10 minutes. And the last time I checked, nobody got in trouble for finishing 30 seconds or a minute early. Everybody was like, oh, that was a great talk. And now we're back on schedule, cool. And then at the coffee afterwards, somebody says, oh, Andrew, I remember your talk. Not only was it really interesting, but you helped us get back on schedule because you weren't like everyone else who took an extra 3 minutes.
Or you probably left more time for questions.
Or you left more time for
questions. Which is even better. At least you answer the questions from the audience. You talk to the audience instead of telling them what they should know.
Yeah.
True or false, and why? You should not record yourself because it can destroy your self-image.
False. You should record yourself, but you should listen to the recording in a very specific way. And the way you should listen to yourself on tape is not the entire thing. You should listen to a 30-second segment in the middle. And in that 30-second segment, you should identify one thing that you liked and you'd like to do more, and one thing that you'd like to change. And then you should delete the recording, do it again, and make those 2 shifts. Do more the thing that you like, do less the thing that you don't like. But you only need 30 seconds, and it needs to be in the middle. And until you've done this 5, 10, 15, 20 times, you should not listen to the entire recording of your talk because you very likely will undermine your self-confidence.
Okay, next. True or false? Slides are just a visual transcript of your speech. So what you're saying must be clearly reflected in the slides.
False. Your slides are not a transcript of your speech. Your slides should have very few words on them. However, any words on your slides, you should say. So the words that, unless it's, maybe the key to a graph or something, but the words that are on your slides need to be the same words that you're using. Too often what happens is we put written words on the slides, and then when we speak, we use a slightly different vocabulary because it's spoken word. And this creates a disconnect for the audience of, wait a minute, that's not quite the same thing. Which one's right? And they may both be right, but while the audience is trying to figure out which one's right, they're not listening to you anymore. So you need very few words on your slides, and the words on your slides that do exist should be words that naturally occur when you speak.
Even if you have a lot of results to show, you should still use fewer slides.
True or false?
True or false?
True, because you shouldn't show a lot of results. You should choose key results to show. And then you have a Q&A at the end. You should tell people that other results exist. And you should set up your final slide in a way that it can be interactive, which you can do on PowerPoint. And you shouldn't waste your final slide with a thank you, because your final slide is the one that is often there for the longest. But you should have on that final slide the ability to hyperlink to the slides that people might ask questions about, including the results that you didn't show. If you're doing a 10-minute talk, one result. If you're doing a 20-minute talk, maybe 2 or 3. If you're doing an hour talk, 2 or 3 results. We're not going to remember 5, 6, 7, 8 results. Talks are about creating memories. Don't overwhelm us with results. Your job is to choose which one you want us to share.
Yeah, in such cases, I also advise when there is a chance, make the last slide the one that people, especially in conferences where people can't take photos of the slides, the one that people can take a snapshot of, and tell the audience you can take a photo of this slide, so you can keep it in your phone for whatever reason. There could be references, there could be some extra information, but it can be, like you say, a hyper-linked slide that will make sense even afterwards when the conference ends.
I like that last slide to be a bit of summary of what was talked about, as well as some things for future conversation. I mean, one of the nice things about visuals now is we're working in a widescreen world, right? So it's very easy to have 2 columns or high and low. And you can have either the left or the upper part of the slide be things that were talked about. And you can have either the right or the lower part of the slide be things that could be talked about in a future conversation. Because really, you want your presentation to be the beginning of a future conversation.
True or false? In a PowerPoint presentation, you must have per slide 1 image or 1 graph or 1 message.
I'm gonna surprise you and say false. Oftentimes, the challenge for audiences is not each individual message, but the relationship between the messages. And I like to focus slides on creating connective tissue between messages. So often I will have slides like the final slide I was just talking about. I'll have slides that create connective tissue visually and show the relationship between ideas. And those slides will have more than one idea. But when I'm sharing an idea, or I'm sharing a visual, or I'm sharing a data, one at a time.
True or false? Images are much better than words or bullet points.
Better than bullet points, for sure, because bullet points obscure relationships between ideas. So bullet points should always be turned into some sort of graphic that displays the relationship. Some ideas, a word is exactly the right thing. Sometimes images are exactly the right thing. You should do both, and you should choose strategically for which one the moment calls for. Am I allowed to cheat and say neither? Because I just said neither.
That's fine. I'm just putting here things that people often ask or often say or think about maybe. And so that's where I'm trying to frame it in a way that, well,
I love it.
It can be a bit provocative, maybe not. So
they're good questions.
Okay, next one, even more provocative. True or false? Being provocative or emotional during a presentation is a sign of immaturity and unprofessional behavior.
False. Being purely objective and neutral misses the moment. The moment calls for you to present. And you are a human being and you have emotions. And we want to connect with you. We want to hear more than we could learn from just a journal article. And the more than we can learn are the things that you think are important and the reason you think they're important. And we need to not only hear that from a content perspective, but we need to hear that from an emotional perspective as well.
Basically, you should not be a talking research paper. You should be a human being.
You should be a human being.
That's how you get memorable, right?
There's a really simple difference between a journal article and a presentation. You. In the journal article, we lots of times we kind of erase the author, depending on the field. In the presentation, we want the author to be there.
True or false? Because in academia, we assume unbiased presentation style, emotional stories and dramatic visuals contradict it. So it contradicts the very essence of academic
False.
existence. Or
Performative contradicts it. Authenticity does not.
where's the line between the two?
The line between the two is you. The line between the two is, where are these emotions coming from? Where are these gestures coming from? Are you watching a TED Talk and learning the top 30 gestures that you should be saying in order to perform well on a viral talk, in which case that's performative? That's not authentic. Are you saying, were you not surprised at all by the results, but you think that if you say you were surprised, people will react positively, and you're actually being dishonest? That's performative, and it's garbage, and it doesn't belong in a research talk. But what does belong is the truth. And the truth is, you did this research. We're not here to invent a story. We're here to share the story of the research in a way that is real and is human.
That's a very good answer.
Thank you.
But I'll try to challenge it. So
I welcome
I can
that.
imagine when a performance can slowly translate into your authenticity when you practice it well enough. And I'm not showing dishonesty. I'm saying performance means body language,
Voice.
your voice, the rate of your speech or whatever else you can put in there. So all this, I would say, external things you can practice still, but at first they feel like you're performing, so it's hard to really do it for many people, but then eventually they become yours. And do you think that's the way to do it? Or if you authentically can't do it from birth, I would say, you shouldn't really do it.
I think when we look at children, we know that we can do it from birth. And what we do is we train it out of people. And what I do with my work with people is create the space that allows it to reemerge. It's not performative if it's how you actually feel. I see this over and over again where somebody will say, we were super excited when we got this result, or we were surprised when we got this result, or I'm very dedicated to doing this work. And I'll simply say to them, well, you say you're dedicated, but you don't sound dedicated. Or you said you were surprised, but you didn't sound surprised. Or you say you were excited by this, but you didn't sound excited. And they're like, well, I'm just giving a talk. I can't be, I'm like, no, think back. Like, and sometimes I'll even have them close their eyes. So close your eyes for a moment. Put yourself back in that space. When you did the calculation and you sat and you waited for the computer to do the calculation, and then the computer gave you the calculation and you saw it, how did you feel? That's the space that we're trying to find. That's the space that isn't performative because it's true. And everybody has that in them.
True or false? A good talk is about building an idea inside the listener's mind and not quite about selling your narrative. So talks should not turn into sales pitches.
True. And I would go a step even further. A good talk is about allowing each audience member to have an idea form in their mind. And it's actually okay if those ideas are different. Everybody doesn't have to hear the same thing. Everybody doesn't have to come away with the same thing. What you want people to come away with something that is clear and that is true, but it doesn't actually have to be the same for everyone. And your job is to create the space that allows them to engage with your work so that then they can make sense of it in a way that's important for them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That was a very good discussion.
This has been fun.